I believed him because believing him had become a habit. When my husband told me he needed to transfer $750,000 overseas for an urgent investment, he said it the same way he always did. Calm, certain, almost bored. As if the number meant nothing. As if money that large moved itself when a man with confidence asked it to. He didn't sit me down. He didn't ask my opinion. He mentioned it while scrolling on his phone, one hand around his coffee mug, already mentally elsewhere. I nodded. I always did. For years, I had been the kind of wife people praised. Understanding, low maintenance, someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions, someone who trusted. In our marriage, silence had passed for maturity. I had learned that early, peace was preserved by not interrupting his certainty. So when he said the transfer had to happen immediately, that it was about future stability and protecting what we'd built, I didn't challenge him. I didn't ask where the opportunity was, or why it required that much money, or why it had to be sent abroad. I told myself that marriage meant trusting the person who always spoke with confidence. I went to bed that night believing him. I woke up hours later, long before dawn, with that strange sense that something was wrong. Not loud, not urgent, just quietly out of place. The house was still. His breathing beside me was steady. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying his words in my head. Urgent investment, overseas, temporary. I slipped out of bed without waking him. It wasn't suspicion that pulled me toward the study. It was instinct. The kind you learn to ignore after years of convincing yourself you're imagining things. I told myself I was just checking something practical, something small. I opened my laptop, logged in the way I always did, my fingers moving automatically. The transfer was already there. The amount was exactly what he had said, $750,000. The date matched. The timestamp showed it had gone through hours earlier, but where it had gone, who it had gone to, stopped my breath. It wasn't an investment fund. It wasn't a corporation. It was a personal account, a woman's name, an overseas bank. I stared at the screen, long enough for my eyes to start burning. My first thought was that I had misunderstood something, that there must be another layer I wasn't seeing. I clicked through the details slowly, carefully, as if moving too fast might shatter whatever fragile logic still held the night together. The destination country made my stomach drop, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was familiar in the wrong way. A place people didn't go for short trips, a place known for long stays, for medical care, for starting something new far from home. I felt very cold. I checked the memo attached to the transfer. It was short, clinical, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A reference to medical support, a timeline, a note that made no sense unless you already knew the truth. She wasn't there for business. She was there to give birth. The realization didn't come with a scream or tears or a rush of anger. It landed quietly, like something heavy being set down in the center of my chest. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I simply sat there, staring at the screen, understanding that the marriage I thought I was protecting had never been what I believed. This wasn't just an affair. This was a parallel life. The money wasn't a mistake. It wasn't desperation. It was preparation. Carefully planned, confidently executed, hidden behind my silence and his certainty. And it hadn't happened in a vacuum. The structure was too clean, the steps too precise. This wasn't the first time money had moved without my knowledge. It was just the largest. I closed the laptop slowly and sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me. Everything looked the same, the walls, the furniture, the photos we had framed years ago, but something fundamental had shifted, and I could feel it in my bones. I realized then that my silence had never been neutral. It had been assumed, counted on, used. I didn't wake him. I didn't confront him. I didn't send a message or make a call. I went back to bed and lay beside him, staring into the darkness, my mind suddenly very clear. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering how to keep the peace. I was wondering how much of the truth had been built on the fact that I never spoke. And for the first time, I understood that saying nothing didn't mean nothing was happening. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there beside him, counting his breaths, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest in the dark. He slept deeply, the way people do when they believe everything is under control. At some point, I stopped feeling cold and started feeling steady. Whatever panic might have come never arrived. What settled instead was a strange, quiet alertness. When morning came, it came gently. Pale light crept through the curtains. The house woke up the same way it always did, as if nothing had changed. He stretched, yawned, reached for his phone. I got up first and went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I set out 2 cups. My hands moved with practiced ease. If I looked like myself, it was because I had been trained to look like myself no matter what was happening inside. He joined me a few minutes later, already scrolling, already distracted. He said something about traffic, about a meeting, ordinary words, stacked on top of an extraordinary lie. I nodded at the right moments. I even smiled once, out of habit. But my mind wasn't in the kitchen. It was back at the screen from the night before, replaying details with surgical clarity. The name on the transfer had not been a placeholder. It wasn't abbreviated. It wasn't coded. It was a full legal name, spelled carefully, the way people spell things they expect to last. I had seen enough financial documents over the years to know what legitimate investments looked like. This wasn't one of them. There was no fund identifier, no corporate routing structure, just a person. A woman. And she wasn't hidden very well, she was hidden just enough. After he left for work, I went back to the study. I didn't rush. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. Proof already existed. What I needed now was understanding. I pulled the transaction back up and followed the trail slowly. Each click confirmed what I already knew. The account was personal. The bank overseas wasn't chosen for performance or returns. It was chosen for discretion, for convenience, for distance. Distance had always been his favorite tool. I searched the location next, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't projecting meaning onto coincidence. The country had strict privacy protections, advanced medical facilities, and a reputation for long-term stays under the guise of care. People went there to disappear politely, to handle things quietly, to start lives that didn't ask for permission. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The timeline clicked into place. The urgency, the suddenness, the way he had framed the transfer as something that could not wait, something that did not invite discussion. It wasn't about markets or timing or opportunity, it was about necessity, about ensuring someone else's future before questions could surface. I reopened the file and noticed the memo again. It was almost invisible, a line of text easy to overlook if you trusted the sender. A reference number tied to a medical account, a phrase about extended support. The kind of language people use when they don't want to write the real reason down. I understood then that the money wasn't just for her. It was for the child. That realization landed differently than the first. The affair had been a betrayal of marriage. This was a betrayal of reality, a declaration that he had built a second future alongside the one I thought we were sharing, and he had done it with confidence, with planning, with the quiet assumption that I would never look too closely. I didn't feel anger yet. What I felt was something heavier, a recognition of scale. This wasn't a moment of weakness or recklessness. This was a strategy. He had chosen an amount that could support someone comfortably. He had chosen a place where questions were minimized. He had chosen a time when I was least likely to interrupt. And I had played my part perfectly. I started noticing details I might have ignored before. The way the transfer was structured through intermediary steps, the absence of friction, the clean execution. It told me he had done this kind of thing before, even if not this exact thing. Money didn't move like this on a first attempt. It moved like this when someone was practiced. What unsettled me most was not the secrecy, but the confidence behind it. He had trusted that I would stay quiet, that I would accept explanations, that I would value peace over clarity, like I always had. And he wasn't wrong, at least not until now. I thought about waking him, about standing in the doorway with my laptop open, asking him to explain himself. I imagined the words he would use, how calm he would sound at first, how reasonable, how he would frame it as complicated, temporary, misunderstood. I didn't want to hear any of it. Confrontation would have given him control again. It would have turned this into a conversation he could manage. I wasn't ready to give him that. Instead, I took screenshots. I saved documents. I noted dates and amounts and account paths. Not with urgency, but with care. As if I were cataloging something that had already ended. By the time I closed the laptop, the house was quiet again. Morning had fully arrived. The world outside moved forward, unaware of the fracture running through my life. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the certainty settle. I no longer wondered if I was mistaken. I no longer hoped for an explanation that would make this less true. What I didn't know yet was how many other people had helped him believe this could stay hidden. And that question, more than anything else, told me I was only at the beginning. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't what I found on the screen. It was the way the morning unfolded as if nothing had happened. The house filled with ordinary sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, a car passing outside. I moved through rooms I knew by heart, touching surfaces I had chosen years ago, realizing how carefully this life had been staged to feel solid, familiar, safe. But safety had been an illusion built on coordination. I noticed it when I opened the transaction history again and followed the path one step further than I had the night before. Not the amount, not the destination, the intermediary. There was a name attached to one of the routing steps. A surname I recognized instantly, not because it was rare, but because it belonged to someone who had been sitting at my dinner table for years. Someone who had laughed with me, asked about my work, complimented my cooking. Someone who had always spoken about family as if it were a sacred thing. My husband's uncle. I stared at the name until the letters lost their shape. I hadn't imagined it. It wasn't a coincidence. The routing structure was intentional, and it had been designed to look familiar, trusted, harmless. That was when I understood this hadn't been done alone. I went back through older records, not digging wildly, just scrolling slowly, the way you do when you're not searching for proof anymore, only patterns. And there they were. Smaller transfers, less dramatic amounts, always clean, always indirect, always touching the same network of names tied to his family's financial world. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it, and I had never looked before. Memory rearranged itself without my permission. I remembered holidays where financial conversations happened around me, but never with me. Papers passed from one person to another while someone said, "It's already handled." I remembered being told I didn't need to worry about those things, that it was complicated, that it was better if I stayed out of it. At the time, I had thought it was kindness. Now I saw it had been training. I sat back and let myself remember a particular dinner from years earlier, one that had always bothered me but never enough to question. We had been celebrating something. I couldn't even recall what anymore. And his family had been in unusually high spirits. Money had come up briefly, a project, an opportunity overseas. Someone joked about how lucky my husband was to have such a supportive wife. I had smiled, everyone had smiled. I understood now that I had been part of the reassurance. My presence had been proof that nothing needed explaining. The deeper I looked, the clearer the structure became. My husband made decisions, his family smoothed the edges, and I remained untouched by details. My silence had allowed things to move freely, unchallenged, unquestioned. I hadn't been excluded because I wasn't trusted. I had been excluded because my trust was already assumed. What unsettled me most was how ordinary it all felt in hindsight. There was no single dramatic moment where alarms should have gone off. Just a long series of small dismissals, softened by affection and routine. I realized then that this transfer, the one for $750,000, wasn't a betrayal that had come out of nowhere. It was simply the point at which the scale could no longer hide. I found documents I remembered signing years ago, ones that had been presented quickly with reassurance. Joint arrangements, financial frameworks, language dense enough to discourage curiosity. At the time, I had trusted the smiles around me more than the words on the page. Now those pages looked different. I didn't yet understand exactly what I was looking at, but I recognized the shape of something important. Structures had been built, permissions granted, oversight delegated. And somewhere inside all of that, There was a reason my husband had felt so confident moving that much money without even glancing in my direction. He believed the system would protect him. The realization didn't make me feel small, it made me feel alert. By midday, messages began to come in, not from him but from his family. Casual at first, checking in, asking how I was. The tone was light, almost affectionate, but I could feel the tension beneath it, like a hand hovering too close to your shoulder. They knew something was moving. They just didn't know how much I knew. I responded politely, briefly, the way I always had. There was no accusation in my words, no hint of discovery. And in their replies, I sensed a hesitation that hadn't been there before, a carefulness as if they were testing the ground. That was when it became clear to me that the deception wasn't just personal, it was communal, maintained not by one man's lies, but by a network that had learned how to keep things quiet. I didn't feel rage, I felt clarity. This wasn't about confronting a husband or exposing an affair. It was about understanding a structure that had been built with my compliance and learning where it was weakest. Late in the afternoon, I came across a document I had signed during our early years together. I remembered the day vaguely. I remembered being told it was routine, that it was for protection, that it didn't change anything. I stared at my signature for a long time. Whatever had been set in motion back then was older than the transfer, older than the woman overseas, older even than the child she was carrying. And I understood that whatever came next wouldn't begin with anger. It would begin with reading what I had once trusted without question. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was behind the truth. I felt like I was finally standing where it could no longer move without me noticing. I moved through that morning the way I always had, and that was when it struck me how practiced I was at pretending nothing was wrong. I made the bed. I wiped the counter. I answered a message from work. From the outside, I looked functional, calm, reliable. Inside, something heavier than anger had settled in. A recognition that my silence hadn't been situational. It had been structural. I had learned it slowly. In the early years of our marriage, my husband used to say he admired how easy I was, how I didn't create drama, how I trusted him. Those words had felt like praise then. I had worn them like a badge, proof that I was mature, supportive, different from the women he complained about. When decisions came up, especially financial ones, he framed them as burdens he was sparing me from. "I'll handle it," he would say. "It's complicated. You don't need to worry about this." And I didn't. Not because I couldn't understand, but because I was told I didn't have to. There was comfort in letting someone else carry the weight. There was safety in believing that love meant protection. Over time, the pattern hardened. Conversations happened around me instead of with me. Documents were slid across the table with tabs already marked, signatures already anticipated. His family reinforced it without ever saying it outright. They praised me for being agreeable, for not interfering, for knowing my place without being told. At the time, I thought that was harmony. Looking back now, I could see how carefully it had been cultivated. I remembered a meeting years ago, early enough that I still felt new to the family. Papers spread across a polished table, numbers discussed quickly. Someone joked that I'd fall asleep if they explained it all. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, embarrassed and eager to belong. When the document reached me, I signed where they pointed. Routine, they said, standard, nothing to worry about. That was the day I learned how silence could be mistaken for consent. The cost of being the good wife wasn't immediate. It accumulated quietly. I lost context first, then awareness, then the habit of asking questions. Each time I deferred, it felt small, insignificant. But together, those moments built a structure where my absence from decision-making became expected. By the time $750,000 moved overseas without my knowledge, the system didn't consider my input missing. It considered it unnecessary. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. I felt the instinct to blame myself rise up, familiar and sharp. I should have asked more. I should have insisted. I should have paid closer attention. But the thought didn't last. It dissolved under the weight of a clearer truth. I hadn't failed to protect myself. I had followed the rules that were given to me, rules designed to keep me uninformed. Silence had never been neutral, it had been assumed. As the day went on, I pulled out old folders and revisited moments I had brushed past before. Agreements I had signed quickly, clauses I had skimmed. Each page felt different now, not because the words had changed, but because I was reading them with eyes that no longer trusted reassurance. A quiet unease replaced the anger I still hadn't felt. What exactly had I agreed to? What authority had I delegated without realizing it? What protections might exist that I had never needed before? The questions didn't frighten me, they steadied me. By evening, my husband called to say he'd be late. His voice was casual, confident, unchanged. I listened, responded politely, hung up. It occurred to me then how strange it was that he still believed he was managing the situation. That words and timing and confidence could shape reality the way they always had. I didn't correct him. The silence I was holding now wasn't the silence he was used to. It wasn't fear or accommodation. It was observation. I was watching patterns emerge, watching who reached out and who avoided me, watching how easily concern turned into caution when I didn't reassure anyone. For the first time, I understood that silence could be a boundary. That night, I sat with one particular document longer than the others. I remembered the day I signed it vividly now. The warm room, the smiles, the sense that everything was secure. I traced my signature with my finger and felt no regret, only resolve. The past couldn't be undone, but it could be understood. And understanding, I was beginning to see, was where my power had been waiting all along. I closed the folder and set it aside, not yet ready to act, but ready to read more closely than I ever had before. Whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional. It would be precise. For years, my silence had protected their certainty. Now it would protect my clarity. I went back to the document the way you return to a place you once passed through without noticing. It wasn't hidden. It had never been hidden. That was the unsettling part. The folder sat exactly where it always had, labeled in neutral language that promised safety and order. Years ago, I had signed it without hesitation, trusting the tone more than the substance. Now I opened it slowly, as if the paper itself might resist being read properly. I chose a quiet room. I closed the door. I read from the first page, line by line, without skipping anything. The language was dense but deliberate. Risk mitigation, oversight protocols, contingencies framed as protection for all parties. It was written by people who assumed no one would read it closely unless they had to. I realized then that this document wasn't meant for moments of happiness. It was meant for moments of exposure. I felt no rush of hope, only focus. As I moved deeper into the pages, I noticed how often the word discretion appeared, always paired with accountability. How authority was never absolute, only delegated. How control existed only as long as transparency was presumed. These weren't romantic ideas. They were mechanical, cold, effective. Then I saw it. A clause embedded midway through the document. Not highlighted, not emphasized. Written in the same careful tone as everything else. It governed large transfers beyond domestic boundaries. It specified conditions under which oversight would be automatically triggered. It did not accuse. It did not punish. It simply shifted control when certain risks were introduced. One sentence stopped me. Any substantial transfer of marital assets to a non-transparent personal beneficiary abroad, particularly where the purpose could expose the marital entity to undisclosed obligations, would initiate a mandatory review and temporary suspension of unilateral control. I read it again, then a third time. This wasn't a trap. It was a safeguard. One I had unknowingly agreed to when trust was abundant and fear non-existent. It didn't require confrontation. It didn't ask for proof of betrayal. It didn't care about motives or emotions. It cared only about structure. And structure was exactly what had been violated. The clause didn't demand my permission to act. It didn't need my anger. It required only documentation, a trail, a fact pattern that already existed. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. For years, I had believed my silence had cost me power. I understood now that it had preserved something else entirely. Because I had never interfered, never challenged, never disrupted the framework was intact. Because I had trusted the process still worked. And because the transfer had been done with such confidence, such disregard for scrutiny, it had crossed the very threshold the clause was designed to catch. There was an irony there that I couldn't ignore. The same silence that allowed him to build a second life had also kept this protection untouched. I read the surrounding sections carefully, making sure I understood what the clause did not do. It didn't freeze everything permanently. It didn't assign blame. It didn't notify personal contacts. It transferred authority from individual discretion to formal review, quietly, automatically, irreversibly, at least in the short term. This wasn't revenge. It was gravity. I imagined briefly what would happen if I confronted him now, if I held the document up and pointed to the line that mattered. He would argue, he would minimize, he would promise explanations later, he would ask for time, and in doing so he would try to regain control of the narrative. I didn't want the narrative anymore. What I wanted was alignment between truth and consequence, between action and structure, between what had been done and what would follow. The clause didn't belong to me emotionally. It belonged to the system we had agreed to without ever expecting to need it. That made it stronger than anything I could say. I gathered the documentation calmly. Screenshots of the transfer, account details, dates. I didn't annotate them with opinion or context. I let them stand on their own. Facts didn't need embellishment. As I worked, I noticed how steady my hands were. There was no thrill in this, no sense of triumph. Just a quiet narrowing of focus, like turning a dial until the picture came into clarity. I thought about how many times I had been told not to worry, how often I had been assured that things were handled. This was handling, just not in the way anyone had expected. By the time I finished assembling the materials, the day had shifted. Light moved across the floor. The house felt neutral again, no longer charged with discovery. What I had found didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a release. I didn't send anything yet. I sat there for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what I now understood. Once initiated, the process could not be undone quietly. There would be questions, reviews, limitations. Not because I asked for them, but because the structure demanded them. For the first time since that night, I felt ahead of the truth instead of chasing it. I closed the folder not with urgency but with certainty. Whatever happened next would not depend on my voice, my emotions, or my willingness to explain. The system would do what it was designed to do once I stepped aside and let it see what had been hidden. And I realized then that I didn't need to expose the lie. I only needed to stop protecting it. I waited until the house was quiet again. Not because I was afraid of being interrupted, but because I wanted the moment to be clean, undisturbed. I didn't light a candle or pour a drink or sit dramatically at the desk. I simply opened my laptop, the same way I had hundreds of times before, and logged into the system that had always existed quietly in the background of our life. There was no ceremony to it. I navigated to the section I had read the night before, the clause that had shifted everything without raising its voice. The process was exactly as the document described. Plain, procedural, almost boring. A form, a checklist, a place to attach files, a neutral field for a brief explanation that did not invite commentary. I didn't write much. I didn't explain my marriage. I didn't describe the woman overseas or the child she was carrying. I didn't accuse my husband of deception or betrayal. I selected the category that applied, attached the documentation, and confirmed that the transfer met the criteria outlined in the agreement. That was it. One step. The system acknowledged receipt with a message that contained no judgment, no emotion, no hint of what would follow. It didn't congratulate me or warn me. It simply confirmed that the review process had been initiated and that temporary measures would apply according to protocol. I stared at the confirmation for a moment longer than necessary, not because I expected anything else to happen, but because I wanted to feel what I felt. There was no rush of relief, no surge of power, just a quiet sense of alignment, like something that had been slightly crooked for years had finally clicked into place. I closed the laptop and went back to my day. I answered emails, I folded laundry, I made a late lunch and ate it standing at the counter. My husband texted to say he'd be late again. I replied with a single word. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. That was the strange part. From the outside, nothing had changed. But underneath, a mechanism had been set in motion that didn't require my participation anymore. I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I wasn't watching the clock. The process didn't speed up if I checked on it, and it didn't slow down if I ignored it. For the first time in years, control had moved somewhere else. I realized then how much of my life had been spent managing outcomes through anticipation, trying to predict moods, smooth over tensions, prevent discomfort. This was different. This wasn't management. It was release. The truth didn't need me to stand behind it anymore. In the late afternoon, I noticed small, almost imperceptible signs that something was happening. A delayed confirmation on a routine account notification. A message that used slightly more formal language than usual. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. Just enough to tell me the system had shifted from passive to attentive. I didn't tell anyone. When my husband came home that evening, he seemed tired but unchanged. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, asked about my day, complained about work. I listened. I responded. I watched him move through the house with the same confidence he always had, unaware that the ground beneath that confidence was no longer stable. There was a moment, brief, uninvited, when I wondered if I should say something, if I owed him a warning, if silence now was cruel in a way silence before had not been. The thought passed. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't even exposure. It was consequence. And consequences don't require announcements. They arrive on their own schedule, through channels no one controls once they've been opened. That night, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television playing something neither of us was really watching, I felt a calm settle into my body that I hadn't known I was missing. It wasn't numbness, it was distance. A clean separation between what I could influence and what I no longer needed to. He checked his phone more often than usual, frowned once, dismissed it. I noticed, but I didn't react. The process had begun, and I had stepped out of its way. Later, lying in bed, I thought about how often I had been told that silence was dangerous, that speaking up was the only way to protect yourself. I understood now that silence was only dangerous when it served someone else's lie. This silence was mine. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't avoiding. I had simply stopped standing between the truth and the structure designed to respond to it. By the time I turned off the light, I knew something fundamental had changed. Not because anything had exploded or been revealed, but because the last quiet moment before impact had passed. Tomorrow, the system would speak. And when it did, no one would be able to pretend this had been an accident. The morning arrived quietly, as if it didn't know what it was carrying. Light slipped through the curtains, pale and ordinary. The alarm went off at the usual time. My husband reached for his phone without opening his eyes, thumb moving by instinct. I watched him from my side of the bed, fully awake, aware that this was the last moment where everything still looked the same. He frowned almost immediately. At first, it was mild irritation, the kind that comes from a slow connection or a delayed app. He tapped the screen again, more firmly this time, sat up, scrolled. His expression tightened, not with fear yet, but with confusion. "That's strange," he muttered, mostly to himself. I didn't ask what was wrong. I swung my legs out of bed and went to the bathroom, letting the sound of running water fill the space between us. By the time I came back, he was already dressed, phone in hand, posture stiff in a way I recognized. This wasn't annoyance anymore. This was disruption. In the kitchen, I made coffee like I always did. The smell filled the room, grounding and familiar. He stood near the counter, refreshing his screen, checking another app, then another. Each time the same result. A pause. A delay. A neutral message that didn't explain anything and didn't apologize. "Must be a system issue," he said too quickly. I poured the coffee and set the mug down in front of him. He barely noticed. A notification chimed. Then another. His jaw tightened as he read them, eyes moving faster now, shoulders rising. The language was formal, procedural. It didn't accuse or alarm. It simply informed him that certain functions were temporarily unavailable pending review. Pending review? I watched the word land. He picked up his phone again, dialing a number he clearly knew by heart. It rang, went to voicemail. He tried another. This time someone answered, and I could hear his voice shift immediately. Controlled, polite, authoritative. He asked questions without giving details, framed the issue as a technical delay, something easily fixed. As the call went on, his tone changed. The confidence drained out of it, replaced by urgency. Then frustration. He turned slightly away from me, lowering his voice, pacing now, running a hand through his hair. I took a sip of my coffee and listened. The answer he was getting wasn't the one he expected. He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment, as if it had betrayed him. "They're reviewing something," he said finally. "Probably routine." Probably. Another alert came in, then another. Emails this time, the same careful language, repeated across different platforms. Access limited, authority adjusted, further information to follow. This wasn't a glitch. Glitches didn't coordinate. He sat down heavily, rubbing his forehead. I could see the moment when he realized this wasn't happening on one system or one account or one mistake. This was happening everywhere at once, with a precision that couldn't be argued with. "Did you do something?" he asked suddenly, looking up at me. The question wasn't accusatory, it was startled, as if the idea had just occurred to him and he didn't quite believe it yet. I met his eyes calmly. "Do what?" He hesitated, clearly unsure how to phrase whatever he was thinking. "There's something going on," he said, "with the accounts." I nodded. "It sounds like they're reviewing them." That was all. He stared at me, searching for something. Panic, guilt, defensiveness. He found none of it. Whatever he had expected this moment to look like, this wasn't it. His phone buzzed again. This time the message wasn't automated, it was from his family. I didn't see the words, but I saw the effect. His face drained of color. He stood up abruptly, stepping away to take the call. I could hear fragments of the conversation from the other room, raised voices, overlapping questions, confusion hardening into alarm. "What do you mean restricted? Since when?" "No, it's not supposed to work like that." I set my cup in the sink and wiped the counter slowly, giving him privacy he hadn't asked for. When he came back, his composure was gone. Not entirely, but enough that I could see the edges of panic breaking through. "They're saying there's been some kind of compliance trigger," he said. "That certain actions set off a review." I said nothing. Across the ocean, the consequences were arriving too. I knew that without being told. Plans built on certainty don't survive uncertainty well. Somewhere far away, a woman who had believed she was protected was discovering that protection had limits. My husband checked his phone again, then again as if sheer repetition might change the outcome. His confidence, so solid for so long, was unraveling in real time. "This is ridiculous," he said, more to the room than to me. "It's just temporary, I'll straighten it out." But even as he spoke, I could hear doubt creeping into his voice. The calls kept coming. From his family now, no longer casual, no longer gentle. Their questions had sharpened, their reassurance had vanished. Whatever they had believed could be managed quietly was no longer staying quiet. By mid-morning, the house felt different, charged, not with shouting or confrontation, but with the absence of control. The structure he had relied on was no longer responding to him, and he didn't yet understand why. I moved through the day with an odd sense of calm. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't bracing for impact. The impact was already happening, spreading outward in careful, unstoppable waves. At one point, he looked at me again, really looked this time, as if trying to see me for the first time that morning. Something in his expression shifted then, not fear exactly, but recognition. The dawning awareness that whatever had begun wasn't going to be fixed with a phone call or a conversation. The certainty he had built his life on was failing. And as the morning wore on, it became clear to everyone involved that this wasn't just a problem. It was the beginning of an unraveling that no one could contain anymore. They didn't give it much time. By early afternoon, my phone began to ring in a way it never had before. Not casually, not with the easy familiarity of check-ins and small talk. The first call came from his sister. I let it ring. The second came minutes later, from his mother. I watched the screen light up and go dark again, feeling a strange sense of distance, as if the phone belonged to someone else. By the third call, they stopped pretending it was social. I answered. Her voice was warm, almost soothing, the way it always was when something needed smoothing over. She asked how I was doing. She said she'd heard there was some confusion with the accounts. She laughed lightly, as if the word confusion could shrink what was happening into something manageable. I told her I was fine. There was a pause on the line, brief but loaded. Then she began to explain. Not what had happened, but how I should feel about it. She spoke about stress, about pressure, about how my husband had been trying to do the right thing for everyone. She reminded me how complicated finances could be, how easily misunderstandings happened when systems got involved. I listened without interrupting. She never asked what I knew. She assumed I knew very little. Before she hung up, she said something that stayed with me. Let's not let this turn into something bigger than it needs to be. After the call ended, I realized what they were doing. They weren't asking for information, they were asking for compliance. The messages came next, carefully worded, concern wrapped in reassurance. We just want to make sure everything stays calm. These things can spiral if people overreact. Families work things out quietly. By the time his father arrived at the house unannounced, the air felt thick with expectation. He stood in the doorway like someone arriving to handle a problem, not to understand it. He spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing words that implied reason while pressing for resolution. We're trying to protect everyone here, he said, including you. Protect me from what? The truth had already arrived. They sat across from me, taking turns speaking, their voices overlapping gently, building a narrative where intentions mattered more than actions, where loyalty outweighed accountability, where silence was framed as kindness rather than erasure. At one point, someone mentioned the child. It was done carefully, with practiced softness. An appeal to compassion, a reminder that an innocent life was involved now, that choices should be made with grace. The implication was clear without being stated. Whatever had triggered this situation should be undone for the sake of stability. I felt the weight of it then, not as guilt but as clarity. They weren't asking me to forgive, they were asking me to disappear again. When I didn't respond immediately, his sister leaned forward. You could help fix this, she said gently, if you wanted to. Help fix what? A system reacting exactly as it was designed to? I looked at their faces, at the concern that never quite reached their eyes, at the frustration that flickered when I didn't reassure them. They had come expecting cooperation. What unsettled them wasn't anger or accusation. It was my refusal to perform relief. I didn't do anything, I said finally. The words were simple, factual. They landed heavily. They exchanged glances, recalibrating. The tone shifted. Less warmth now, more urgency. Someone mentioned reputations. Someone else hinted at consequences if things went too far. Not threats exactly, but warnings shaped like concern. I stayed where I was, my hands folded in my lap, my voice even. I repeated myself when necessary, nothing more. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't retract anything because there was nothing to retract. The silence frustrated them more than any argument could have. As the afternoon wore on, their confidence began to crack. They had come prepared for emotion, for denial, for negotiation. They hadn't prepared for neutrality. Without my participation, their moral leverage had nothing to hook into. Eventually they left. Not satisfied, not reassured, just unsettled. When the door closed behind them, the house felt lighter. Not because the pressure was gone, but because it had been exposed for what it was. Control disguised as care. Unity built on silence. That evening, my husband didn't speak much. He paced, checked his phone, took calls he didn't want to explain. I watched him from the other end of the room, noticing how the roles had shifted without a word being spoken. They would try something else next. I could feel it. Emotional pressure hadn't worked, so the approach would change. It always did when silence stopped cooperating. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing for what came next. I understood now that the more they pushed, the more visible the collapse would become. And that was something none of them could afford to ignore anymore. The tone of the messages changed before anyone admitted what was happening. By the next day, the calls from his family slowed, replaced by shorter texts and clipped questions. No one asked how I was anymore. They asked for updates, for timelines, for reassurance that things were being handled. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The pressure had moved somewhere else, into rooms I wasn't invited into. That was when the first inquiry arrived. It wasn't dramatic. No urgent subject line, no accusation, just a professionally worded email from an institution I recognized immediately, requesting clarification on a recent transfer and the associated purpose. The language was precise, neutral, and impossible to misread. This wasn't gossip, it wasn't family interference, it was oversight. I read it once, then again, feeling a quiet confirmation settle in my chest. The system was no longer contained. More messages followed over the next hours. Different departments, different platforms, each one polite, each one focused on facts, dates, amounts, beneficiaries. The kind of questions that don't invite stories, only answers. Whatever had been triggered was now expanding outward, touching every place where his certainty had once moved freely. My husband's response was immediate and frantic. He spent the morning on the phone, pacing from room to room, repeating himself with small variations. He explained things too quickly, contradicted himself without noticing, promised documents he didn't yet have. I could hear the strain creeping into his voice, the way confidence turns brittle when it's no longer reinforced. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and stared at the wall, phone pressed to his ear, listening to something that clearly wasn't going his way. When he hung up, he didn't look at me. He sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. "This is getting complicated," he said. I didn't respond. By afternoon, the family fractured. I could tell from the calls he took behind closed doors, from the way voices rose and fell on the other side of the door. Questions turned into blame. Blame turned into distance. Someone suggested they hadn't known all the details. Someone else insisted they'd only helped with logistics. The unity they'd presented the day before dissolved as soon as it stopped working. No one wanted to be responsible now. Another message arrived, this one formal enough to include a reference number and a deadline. Documents requested, explanations required. The kind of communication that doesn't escalate emotionally, only procedurally. Each step narrowing the space where excuses could exist. Across the ocean, the consequences were unfolding too. I didn't hear it directly, but I could see it in his reactions. The way he flinched when his phone rang. The way he lowered his voice instinctively, as if trying to keep something from spilling out. Whatever certainty had been promised abroad was evaporating. Plans built on smooth transfers don't survive scrutiny well. The woman he had believed was protected was now exposed to the same instability he was. By evening, he finally looked at me, not with accusation or anger, but with something close to disbelief. "I don't understand how this got so big," he said. I met his eyes calmly. Things tend to grow when they're examined. He looked away again, jaw tight. The truth had stopped being something he could manage. It was moving independently now, pulled forward by mechanisms neither of us controlled. Another notification came in just before dinner. This one was unmistakable. A formal notice outlining the scope of review and the next steps. The language was courteous, but the meaning was final. This wasn't a pause. It was a process. He read it twice, then let the phone fall to his side. There was a moment then, brief but unmistakable, when he understood this wasn't going to be undone quietly. That whatever narrative he had relied on, stress, misunderstanding, good intentions, no longer mattered. The structure he had trusted was dismantling itself piece by piece. Not because I had exposed him, because the truth no longer had anywhere to hide. The house felt smaller that night, not with tension, but with inevitability. Conversations ended quickly. Movements were cautious. Everyone seemed aware that the ground beneath them had shifted, even if they didn't yet know where it would settle. I felt oddly calm. There was no satisfaction in watching this unfold. No sense of victory. What I felt was certainty. The kind that comes when something irreversible has finally crossed from private to public, from protected to examined. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability finding daylight. As I went to bed that night, I understood that whatever came next would no longer be shaped by family pressure or private conversations. Deadlines had been set. Questions were on record. The process was moving forward, indifferent to feelings or appeals. The lie had outgrown the silence that once protected it. And with that, the story had passed the point of no return. He waited until the house was quiet before he finally spoke. Not late at night, not in a rush of panic, but in the heavy stillness that comes after too many failed phone calls. He stood in the doorway of the living room, hands empty, shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. The confidence he usually carried like armor was gone. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded and turned off the lamp. We sat across from each other, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend this was casual. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he started the way I knew he would. "It's not what it looks like," he said quietly. Things got complicated. The word hung between us. Complicated. It had always been his favorite shield. He explained how the transfer had been misunderstood, how systems overreacted, how he had been trying to manage a situation before it spiraled. He talked about timing, pressure, responsibility, about protecting everyone involved. He spoke carefully, choosing language that had worked for years, reasonable words, calm tone, no raised voice, no anger. I listened. That unsettled him more than if I had interrupted. He leaned forward slightly as if trying to draw me in. "I was handling it," he said. "You know how these things work. It just got out of hand." Out of hand, as if it had slipped accidentally from his grasp instead of being built deliberately behind my back. I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch, not aggressively, just long enough for him to feel it. He paused, searching my face. "Say something," he said, the edge in his voice no longer hidden. "I'm listening," I replied. That was when I saw it, the moment he realized explanations weren't landing, that the familiar rhythm of justification and reassurance wasn't restoring his control. His voice wavered slightly as he tried again, this time softer, almost pleading. "We can fix this," he said, "together." Together. The word felt hollow now. I waited until he finished, until there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the house around us. Then I spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but with intention. "I didn't cause this," I said. "I stopped preventing it." He froze. For a second he looked at me as if he hadn't understood. Then the meaning settled in, slow and heavy. His shoulders dropped further. The argument he had prepared collapsed under its own weight. "You knew," he said. "I saw," I corrected. There was no accusation in my voice, no satisfaction, just fact. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The usual counter-arguments didn't come, no deflection, no reframing. The systems he trusted had already answered for me. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said finally. I nodded. It rarely does. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't strategic or protective. It was the sound of authority dissolving. He wasn't angry with me. He was afraid of what he no longer controlled. "I can still talk to them," he said almost to himself. "Explain things." I looked at him steadily. They're not waiting for explanations anymore. That was when it fully sank in. Not that he had been caught, but that he had been overtaken. The family, the institutions, the systems he believed existed to serve him were no longer responding to his voice alone. He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked quietly. I considered the question. "You never asked." It wasn't said with bitterness, just truth. We didn't argue after that. There was nothing left to argue about. The conversation ended the way it began, without drama, without resolution, just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted. That night we moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a temporary space. No accusations, no apologies, just distance settling into place. I slept better than I had in weeks. In the days that followed, the consequences continued without my involvement. More requests, more restrictions, decisions made without consulting him. The power he had assumed was permanent was revealed to be conditional all along. We spoke only when necessary. Logistics, schedules, neutral words. The marriage, I realized, had ended long before this conversation. What remained now was simply the acknowledgement. I felt no urge to explain myself to anyone, not to him, not to his family. The truth had already done its work. For the first time, the chaos wasn't inside me. It had moved outward where it belonged. And as I watched him pack a bag a few days later, not angrily, not dramatically, just with quiet resignation, I understood that this wasn't a victory or a punishment. It was a correction. The moment when control built on silence finally ran out of places to hide. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not the tense quiet that follows an argument, or the brittle silence of things left unsaid. This was different. It was the sound of something finished. Days passed without urgent calls or sudden knocks. The noise that had crowded every corner of the house receded, leaving space where anxiety used to sit. I noticed it first in small ways. I slept through the night. I stopped bracing myself when my phone buzzed. The rooms felt larger, as if they had been holding their breath for years and had finally exhaled. The process continued without either of us guiding it. Emails arrived with timelines and reference numbers. Requests were precise, unemotional, impossible to negotiate with. The language never softened, never escalated. It simply moved forward. My husband's influence diminished with each step, not dramatically, but methodically. Decisions that once defaulted to him now required approval elsewhere. Access was conditional, authority fragmented. He tried to stay ahead of it at first. More calls, more explanations, then fewer, eventually none at all. The family's presence faded too. Where there had once been insistence and pressure, there was now distance. Messages grew formal, conversations ended quickly. The concern that had once been framed as unity shifted into careful detachment. No one asked me to help anymore. No one suggested fixes. The unspoken acknowledgement hung in the air. Whatever had been happening was no longer manageable, and no one wanted to be responsible for it. I didn't pursue closure with them. There was nothing left to explain. Across the ocean, the other thread unraveled on its own. Plans delayed, assurances evaporated, stability proved conditional. I learned this indirectly, through pauses in conversations, through the way my husband stopped referencing the future altogether. The parallel life he had constructed lost its footing once certainty disappeared. I felt no satisfaction in that, just distance. When the decision to separate came, it arrived without ceremony. There was no final argument, no dramatic announcement. We talked about logistics, about timelines, about space. The marriage had already ended. This was simply the part where we stopped pretending otherwise. He packed his things quietly, not angrily, not in a rush. The man who left was not the one who had once spoken with such unshakable confidence. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. Stripped of the authority he had assumed was permanent. We didn't hug, we didn't apologize, there was nothing left to perform. After he left, I sat alone in the living room and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief without triumph. The absence of tension didn't make me euphoric. It made me steady. For the first time in years, my thoughts were my own, uninterrupted by the need to manage someone else's certainty. I spent the following days sorting through the remnants of a life I had once believed in. Papers, objects, photos that no longer carried the weight they used to. I didn't rush. I didn't force myself to feel anything specific. Some losses need time to land properly. I thought often about the woman I had been, the one praised for being easy, for being supportive, for not asking too many questions. I didn't judge her harshly. She had done what she believed was necessary to keep things together. She had trusted because trust had been presented as love. What I understood now was that love does not require erasure. The anger I had expected never fully arrived. It dissolved somewhere along the way, replaced by clarity. I no longer replayed conversations, wondering what I could have said differently. The answers no longer mattered. The structure that had relied on my silence had collapsed under its own weight, not because I attacked it, but because I stepped aside and let it face the truth alone. I felt stronger, not because I had won, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. By the end of the week, the house felt like a place again instead of a battlefield. Mornings became quiet rituals rather than moments of tension. Evenings stretched without the need to anticipate explanations or excuses. I wasn't healed, not completely. Loss doesn't vanish just because clarity arrives, but I was no longer lost. I knew where I stood. I knew what I would and wouldn't protect again. As the final confirmations came in and the process moved toward its inevitable conclusion, I realized something else had settled too. My sense of self. I wasn't defined by what had been taken from me or by what had been exposed. I was defined by what I had reclaimed. The truth had done its work. The noise had faded. What remained was something quieter and far more durable. My life finally was my own again. The morning the last confirmation arrived, I was drinking coffee by the window. There was nothing dramatic about it. No raised heart rate, no shaking hands. Just a short notification confirming what had already been unfolding for weeks. The review was complete. The restrictions were finalized. Control had been reassigned permanently. What had once been presented as temporary had become irreversible. I closed the message and sat there for a long moment, watching the light move across the floor. This was the part of the story people always expect to feel explosive. They imagine celebration, vindication, a rush of triumph. But what I felt instead was something quieter and far more grounding. Finality. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. In the weeks that followed, life didn't magically transform. I still had habits to unlearn, silences to reinterpret, questions that surfaced late at night when the house was too quiet. Healing wasn't linear, and it certainly wasn't fast. But it was honest. I no longer filtered my thoughts through someone else's certainty. I didn't have to anticipate moods or manage narratives. Decisions were made out loud now, even if only to myself. I began to notice how much energy had once gone into staying small, staying agreeable, staying invisible in my own life. That energy returned to me slowly, like circulation coming back to a limb you didn't realize had gone numb. People asked how I was doing. I learned to answer truthfully. Some days were steady, some days were heavy, but none of them were built on lies. And that, I realized, was the difference. Truth doesn't always feel good, but it feels solid. It holds you upright instead of asking you to bend. I thought often about the night everything changed, about how close I had come to closing the laptop and going back to bed, convincing myself that it was none of my business, that asking questions would only cause trouble. That silence, once again, would be easier. What stopped me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The understanding that protecting a lie doesn't preserve peace, it just delays collapse. And the longer it's delayed, the more it takes with it when it finally falls. I didn't end my marriage with confrontation or revenge. I ended it by withdrawing my silence, by refusing to keep holding up a structure that was never built to support me in return. The consequences didn't come because I attacked anyone. They came because the truth was allowed to stand on its own. Now, when I look back, I don't focus on what was taken from me. I focus on what was returned, my voice, my agency, my ability to trust myself again. Those were never things my husband owned, even when I let him believe he did. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, I want you to know something important. You don't need to explode to reclaim your life. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you simply stop covering for what hurts you. Silence can be strategic, but only when it serves you, not when it erases you. If this story resonated with you, if it made you pause or reflect or see your own situation more clearly, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. You're not alone in these experiences. even when they feel isolating. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about hidden truths, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that comes without shouting, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and take a moment to like this video so it reaches others who might need it too. Sometimes the most unexpected endings aren't about winning. They're about finally standing in your own life, unafraid to let the truth speak for itself. The morning the last confirmation arrived, I was drinking coffee by the window. There was nothing dramatic about it, no raised heart rate, no shaking hands, just a short notification confirming what had already been unfolding for weeks. The review was complete. The restrictions were finalized. Control had been reassigned permanently. What had once been presented as temporary had become irreversible. I closed the message and sat there for a long moment, watching the light move across the floor. This was the part of the story people always expect to feel explosive. They imagined celebration, vindication, a rush of triumph. But what I felt instead was something quieter and far more grounding. Finality. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. In the weeks that followed, life didn't magically transform. I still had habits to unlearn, silences to reinterpret, questions that surfaced late at night when the house was too quiet. Healing wasn't linear, and it certainly wasn't fast. But it was honest. I no longer filtered my thoughts through someone else's certainty. I didn't have to anticipate moods or manage narratives. Decisions were made out loud now, even if only to myself. I began to notice how much energy had once gone into staying small, staying agreeable, staying invisible in my own life. That energy returned to me slowly, like circulation coming back to a limb you didn't realize had gone numb. People asked how I was doing. I learned to answer truthfully. Some days were steady, some days were heavy, but none of them were built on lies. And that, I realized, was the difference. Truth doesn't always feel good, but it feels solid. It holds you upright instead of asking you to bend. I thought often about the night everything changed, about how close I had come to closing the laptop and going back to bed, convincing myself that it was none of my business, that asking questions would only cause trouble, that silence, once again, would be easier. What stopped me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The understanding that protecting a lie doesn't preserve peace, it just delays collapse. And the longer it's delayed, the more it takes with it when it finally falls. I didn't end my marriage with confrontation or revenge. I ended it by withdrawing my silence, by refusing to keep holding up a structure that was never built to support me in return. The consequences didn't come because I attacked anyone. They came because the truth was allowed to stand on its own. Now, when I look back, I don't focus on what was taken from me. I focus on what was returned, my voice, my agency, my ability to trust myself again. Those were never things my husband owned, even when I let him believe he did. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, I want you to know something important. You don't need to explode to reclaim your life. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you simply stop covering for what hurts you. Silence can be strategic, but only when it serves you, not when it erases you. If this story resonated with you, if it made you pause or reflect or see your own situation more clearly, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. You're not alone in these experiences, even when they feel isolating. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about hidden truths, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that comes without shouting, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, and take a moment to like this video so it reaches others who might need it too. Sometimes the most unexpected endings aren't about winning. They're about finally standing in your own life, unafraid to let the truth speak for itself. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.